I came across Wayne's latest video entitled Pro-Death Penalty, Yet Pro-Life. In this video, Wayne attempts to convince his audience that capital punishment is wrong. Wayne seems confused as to why Christians would be pro-life while at the same time support capital punishment. His argument is, 1. There is nothing in the New Testament supporting capital punishment. 2. Christ's defense of the woman caught in adultery is proof that Christ was against capital punishment. And 3. We are under a new covenant. We will consider these 3 points, and afterwards we will look at what else he said and demonstrate further errors and inconsistencies.
I don't really understand why Christians are for capital punishment, for the death penalty. Nowhere in our New Testament scriptures do I find any reason, any justification as to why we should kill somebody, even for murder.
Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Let's now turn our attention to some commentaries. Be patient, as I am going to be a bit redundant. Sometimes redundancy is necessary. The word sword refers to the small Roman sword used in capital punishment. This passage and Acts 25:11 give the New Testament basis for capital punishment, while Genesis 9:6 clearly states the Old Testament perspective. Fear is one effective deterrent to chaos. The reference to the state not bearing the sword in vain is to the broader judicial function of the state, particularly its right to deprive of life those who had committed crimes worthy of death. Paul would not have flinched in endorsing the right of ruling authorities to practice capital punishment. The ruler bears that sword in order to instill fear of doing wrong, and in order to inflict punishment when wrong has been done. By means of the sword, wrongdoing is punished. In fact, the vicious, dangerous criminal may even be put to death. The metaphor of the sword has many meanings in Greek literature. It can be a symbol of authority. For example, the police soldiers who accompanied Roman tax collectors were often called sword bearers to legitimate the tax collecting function, but it was also an instrument of capital punishment. As the common method of inflicting capital punishment was by decapitation with a sword, that instrument is mentioned as the symbol of the right of punishment and, as many infer from this passage, of the right of capital punishment. The sword is an emblem of the power of life and death the civil magistrate is invested with, and includes all sorts of punishment he has a right to inflict, and this power is not lodged in him in vain. He may and ought to make use of it at proper times and upon proper persons. The sword, the instrument of capital punishment, which God authorizes him to inflict. His power is delegated to him for the defense and encouragement of the good, and the punishment of the wicked, and he has authority to punish capitally when the law so requires. This the term sword leads us to infer. The sword is an instrument of punishment as well as an emblem of war. Princes were accustomed to wear a sword as an emblem of their authority, and the sword was often used for the purpose of beheading or otherwise punishing the guilty. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. You will notice in Acts 25 that Paul never questioned capital punishment. Instead, he agreed that if he was guilty, he would deserve the death penalty. I searched in vain to find a single commentary that rejected the idea that Romans 13 was condoning the death penalty. I do not think it's necessary to comment any further as to whether or not the New Testament supports capital punishment, unless, of course, you feel that virtually every biblical scholar has erred in their understanding.
What did Jesus say to the woman caught in the act of adultery, which in the Old Testament was something that you would murder someone for? Well, in the New Testament he said, those without sin cast the first stone, and when they all eventually left, he said, where are your accusers? And Jesus said, I don't accuse you either.
As Tom rightly points out, Jesus was making a point to the hypocrisy in the hearts of the ones accusing the woman and showed grace. That doesn't mean he was establishing a new civil law. As Christ taught on adultery, he pointed out the error of people's thinking regarding the law. People were sticklers about the letter of the law and had completely overlooked the spirit of the law. Adultery is not strictly the physical act of having sex with another person's spouse. One could commit adultery through lusting after another's spouse. Thus, the hypocrisy inherent in their desire to kill the woman. Again, however, this passage is not a teaching on civil law. Thus, its use by Wayne is unjustified.
We're under a new covenant under the New Testament.
Wayne uses the "we're under a new covenant" argument a lot. This seems to be the equivalent to the common Arminian retort, but Calvin murdered people. It seems that when people don't like something the Bible has to say, or when they're faced with a scripture they can't explain, they just invent some kind of slogan that's supposed to dismiss whatever it is they have trouble with. I honestly have no idea what "we're under the new covenant" is supposed to mean or what it's supposed to prove. However, if we turn our attention to Genesis 9:6, we'll note something very important. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. What needs to be noted about this passage is that this precept was given prior to the establishment of the Old Covenant. Thus, one cannot claim that it's simply an Old Covenant law with no bearing for us today. However, that would not make any difference. Consider bestiality for a moment. I am not aware of any prohibition in the New Testament against bestiality like the ones we find in the Old Testament. Does it therefore follow that bestiality is just an Old Covenant thing which we no longer need to be concerned with? Furthermore, Wayne doesn't seem to realize the implications of what he's saying. If it's consistent to be pro-life and against the death penalty, because we're under a new covenant, then I guess God must be very inconsistent in the giving of his laws in the Old Covenant. Does not the Old Covenant teach that the murder of babies is wrong, while at the same time teaching capital punishment? Maybe God should have consulted Wayne's impeccable logic first. Since Wayne doesn't explain what is meant by "we're under a new covenant" or why that's relevant, there isn't much more that I can say to this.
Yeah, I know an argument is, well, a baby is innocent, and a human that kills somebody else, well, then they deserve what they get. And also, don't you know that all of us are born into sin? That even an unborn child automatically has inherited that sin?
Here Wayne attempts to use original sin, which babies are infected with, and attempts to use this as his basis for putting babies and murderers on equal footing. In other words, since babies are just as guilty before God as a grown murderer, then it's inconsistent to view babies as innocent while condemning murderers as guilty. Wayne is guilty of confusing spiritual law with civil law. There is nothing in Scripture which gives the state the right to kill an individual for original sin. However, there most certainly are laws which give the state the right to bear the sword against evildoers. And because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent, and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal. Notice in this passage how the sons are innocent. Is this a denial of original sin? No. The innocence spoken of in this passage is in relation to civil law. These children had not broken any of the laws laid out for the Israelites. This passage is about civil law, not spiritual law. Though babies may be guilty before God due to original sin, they are not guilty of any crimes committed against the state. Thus, Wayne's attempted parallel between the grown murderer who has violated civil law and babies who have not is irrelevant in the context of discussing capital punishment.
Also, we should be against unjust wars.
This is a glaring inconsistency on Wayne's part, as any discerning ear should notice. Wayne is attempting to promote the sanctity of life by condemning the death penalty for murderers, yet he has no problem with just wars. Since God has given the state the right to bear the sword, it is just for governments to not only have capital punishment, but also to carry it out, and that justly. The death penalty is much like a just war, only the criminals are within, and it's on a smaller scale. The state must protect its people from those who would seek to harm them, whether foreign or domestic. In an attempt to call for consistency and to promote the sanctity of life, Wayne has shown his own inconsistency in endorsing just wars. Wayne is trying to have his cake and eat it too. In case anyone has forgotten, if it were not for the death penalty, Christ could not have died for the sins of his people. Thank God for capital punishment. I hope this video has been useful for all who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Scripture tells us that teachers will be held to a higher standard and incur a stricter judgment. Since Wayne has now taken on the role of pastor, I pray he will realize that he is not fit for this position and voluntarily step down before heaping more coals onto his head and further leading many astray.